Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. I can't wait for you all to get to know my next guest, Nathaniel Amos. When we first met, I was intrigued by the fact that we share a background in social work and are both dedicated to holding space with people as they transform their relationship to their inner and outer worlds. I immediately found a sense of kinship with him based in the shared language and values we each bring to our work and personal lives. I don't know about all of you, but I find it rare to feel that seen and understood so quickly when in connection with another man. And that gift he provided me made me very clear that he needs to be a guest on this podcast so others can experience it too. Nathaniel describes himself as a son, a lover, and a friend. It is within those identities that he finds himself navigating masculinity the most. He wears many hats as a psychotherapist, social worker, yoga teacher, and adjunct faculty member at a state university. He has so much to offer, and I can't wait to see what he adds to the new masculine. Thanks for joining me, Nathaniel.
Thank you so much. That was so sweet of you. I'm like, ooh, can you talk about me all the time? That would be great.
One of the things that keeps coming up as I talk with men around this is how important male intimacy is. And I just keep wanting to lean further and further into that. I don't mean sexual intimacy. It can be with some men, but I just mean like that intimacy, that ability to be vulnerable and care about each other and share what we like about each other.
Yeah. I love that. And since, it's a podcast and not a television thing, it's just like, I just kept smiling and smiling and smiling. And perhaps I'm secretly a narcissist. I don't know, but that was just so sweet. Thank you.
Yeah, you're so welcome. I'm going to just give you some space to share anything you think is important for the listeners to know. Welcome us into your world.
Great. I think the first thing is that when I've given interviews before and I've talked about things that I think have so many textures and different layers, I find that my mind goes lots of different places. So I always feel like I want to give the disclaimer of buckle up, children, because it's going to get weird, and sort of see how things evolve and sort of where we go. Because, I love this project that you're doing, and I love that there are so many voices, and this is a conversation, because I feel like when I've listened to the episodes that you've published already, I walk away with so many more thoughts about masculinity, and it sort of opens up new textures and new angles. And suddenly I'm thinking 6 million different things, and 30 minutes have gone by and I'm staring at the wall and I'm like, oh, okay. All right. So it feels important to give that disclaimer that I'm may go on several different tangents and all these different kinds of things. But
tangents are fully welcome on this podcast. Right. I want to get a diversity of different voices so that those kinds of things do happen for listeners, so that we think about masculinity in different ways, so that we find what we value about it. We find what needs some change and some shift and transformation, all of those things. So tangents are welcome.
Great. Get ready.
Is there anything about your personal life, your work life, anything that you think is important for people to know as we talk about this? I sort of already kind of gave a little bit of background about the work you're doing in the world in terms of being a psychotherapist, a social worker, a yoga teacher, Anything else you think is important for people to know?
Well, my hope is that stuff will continue to unfold as we continue the conversation. When I think a lot about my friendships, in particular, I feel like I don't have a lot of nice things to say about my relationships with men, um, and I'm still sort of unpacking what that means. And to go back to the thing you said about one of the hopes about doing this project is around trying to generate more intimacy with men. And there's a part of me that if we, and I hope we do get to talk about friendships between men, that there's sort of like this unforgiving, I say a lot of I sort of get in this mode of being like, oh, we're just like penis fighting with each other. And like, it's like this not, feels like sort of not very generous. And what I want to offer is that I love men. I think we're like super complicated. I think there are so many things that I feel challenged by and with, both being a man and then also loving men and having male friends, that I think sometimes I forget to lead with that even though there are times I don't sound very generous about men, sometimes because I think there's not a whole lot to be generous about, but that I think that men are necessary. I think masculinity is necessary. Um, so that's, I think, another feature that I would offer in anticipation of sort of broadly where we're going to go.
Yeah. Well, is it your experience? I'm sort of gathering that from what you were sharing, that male friendships are often not the most common in your life.
They're not. I would say so. I have a twin sister, and so my first friend was my sister.
Mm.
And when I go back through the history of who I have felt closest to, it's been girls when I was younger, and then women as I've gotten older. And one of the things that I'm wary of and more curious about is how much do I lean on those relationships to do a lot of my own emotional labor. Uh, and I would love to say, I have all these like equitable friendships with women, and there's a back and forth, and I think there is. I think that's true. I see that, and also there are certainly ways that I get caught in my own understanding of masculinity, and that I do ask women to do a lot of my emotional labor. And there are several friends, I think the folks who are closest to me, that have called me on that. I had a friend once say to me, I was standing somewhere, or maybe we were at a restaurant or something, and I was looking for my keys, and I was like, "Where are my keys? Where are my keys?" And she was standing across from me, and she's like, "You're man searching," and I was like, "What is that?" And she was like, "You're, instead of actually just looking for your keys and shutting the hell up and doing it, you're trying to induct me into looking for your keys with you, and I don't want to do that." And
I've never heard that term.
yeah, and so it, like those kinds of things, I think there are ways that are unconscious, that I guess I could call insidious or something, that my own masculinity shows up in my friendships with women, that I think I feel more, in some ways, more connected to my female friends, and or my friends who identify as women, and I find myself like in this particular moment, and since I moved to Seattle, which is where there was a big shift, I had more friends who identified as men, and there has been this sort of persistent challenge that I've had connecting with them. And at times it's made me enraged, and it's just made me be like, I don't ever want to have friends that are men again. Um, but and other times it makes me really sad. Other times it makes me really curious, like what's going on here. And I think for when I first moved to Seattle, one of my closest friends, and I think the person with whom I had the most intimate relationship with was a man friend of mine. I did my laundry at his house every week for the first 2 years that I lived here. And I spent some of the holidays with him and his wife. And I think our relationship is very close and in some ways very intimate, but is also haunted by a lot of conflict, a lot of the way that we interact with each other. And I can feel myself pulled into this dynamic is that we like he'll share something and it feels very unidirectional. It's like, this is what I think about this. And then the pull that I feel is to be like, well, I think this about that. And it's very, I sort of have used, I hope this is okay to say on the podcast, but I've sort of have used this term like penis fighting. It's like two unidirectional phalluses sort of like crossing paths at times, as opposed to something that feels a little bit more open, a little bit more generative. I don't mean to be like a biological essentialist, but there does feel something that feels very, very unidirectional and very, at times it's not felt very curious. It felt like we were trying to one up each other or who had the hottest take or something. And it was such a huge departure from my relationships and my friendships prior to that, which did feel more curious, more generative. There were times like certainly there are the stories about the man searching and things like that. There are times where there were sort of more like, I guess we can call that sort of more leaning into conflict or sort of unidirectional, sort of less generative in this way or less curious. But I wasn't used to this. It was such a culture shock to be in friendship with men who said things in declarative sentences, didn't ask a lot of questions. And often we would be sitting next to each other. We wouldn't be facing each other. We'd be like playing a video game or be watching a movie or something. And it was really tough, but he was, the person to whom I was closest for several years. And he and I have known each other since we were 13.
Mm.
So, there's something, and I love him. And you can even hear the hesitancy in me saying that. Isn't that weird masculinity stuff? That just shows up, like, what is so challenging about saying I love him? That is, it felt like we were haunted in this way by a conversational style that felt totally foreign, that felt really challenging to me.
Yeah. You brought up so many like important topics that I hope we can dive into a little further as we get into this conversation. Some of them that I would highlight are sort of that concept within masculinity where I think a lot of men rely on their female identifying or women identifying people in their lives to do the emotional labor for them. I think in most cisgender heterosexual relationships, the one place that a man is able to be vulnerable and to share things or to have any level of emotion is with his wife or girlfriend. And that puts a lot of weight on that one woman to be able to hold all of that, and for a man to not be able to go outside of that relationship to find other sources of emotional support and care and strength puts a lot of pressure on the women in men's lives. And I think that's a really important thing that you're pointing out, that isn't just clearly about sexuality. It's not about whether you're straight or gay or anywhere in between. It's actually more about where does it feel safe to put our emotional burdens on people. And I think many of us have felt that way, that women are the place where it can be. As a fellow gay person in this world, like, women have always been my safe place.
Yep.
And they've always been the place that I can go to. And I've had a similar journey of challenging myself to open to those male relationships and see what they bring up in me, to know that I have enough solid ground underneath myself to watch what that triggers in me and to be able to move through that and transform with that. Because I did notice for a while, as I was sectioning myself off into primarily female relationships, that I was limited. And there was a yearning and an ache for some male intimacy but I didn't feel safe enough to explore it.
Yeah. I'm having two thoughts. The first is sort of thinking about my work as a psychotherapist. A big chunk of what I do is actually work with couples, and I would say at this moment, all of the couples with whom I'm working are all heterosexual, and they're all cis too. So they're all like cis heterosexual people. They're not all in monogamous relationships. And so what I've found is that dynamic that a cishet man relies on she's the only place. And often and I'm thinking about a handful of the couples that I'm working with, where it actually feels really important as the clinician, and then as a male presenting and a male identified clinician, to have a conversation with the male partner in that room at this moment that says, when your wife is talking about being exhausted, this is how it's showing up. And you and I, male partner, need to really work really hard to create a little bit less pressure for your wife to be doing her own emotional labor, your emotional labor, her emotional labor for the children, all of these things. And so that you can have an affective vocabulary to talk about, aside from anger and horniness, which is the two feelings that we're given as men. And instead sort of talking about it all, sometimes I worry this is condescending, but I'll pull out the feeling chart that is for children and be like, what do you feel on this chart? To start to get out of this dynamic where there is so much burden, because I see it place so much stress on relationships.
Totally.
In that way.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes we have to break it down into smaller, more digestible chunks and to meet men where they're at. The reality is as a culture, we haven't done a very good job of teaching men to have any level of emotional literacy outside of, as you were saying, anger and horniness. We don't teach men, and we don't expect that of men. And so sometimes you do have to go back to basic 101, not in an antagonizing or patronizing sort of way, but in a way that they can access, in a way that is meeting them where they're at. And I think that that's what I do as a coach also when I'm working with men is that I have conversations in a different way with men sometimes. And that doesn't mean that it's more simple or that it's less powerful in any way. It just means that it's meeting your client where they are.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting because I teach for a coach training, and the majority of the students that go through it are females, and they, in their journey, they practice coaching each other a lot, and they coach in front of us and get feedback about their coaching. And they don't get the opportunity oftentimes, unless they're seeking it out in their personal lives, to go and coach a man. And they don't. And so when we bring in volunteer clients for the first time and a man shows up, they're like, well, he didn't say things like I expected him to, or he didn't know how to answer this question. I said, yeah, because men are socialized differently in our world, and we have to learn how to meet them there.
Yeah, exactly. And I see that a lot in the clinical work that I do. And, it's interesting. So I'll sort of say this piece and then transition back to friendship for a second. I had a colleague at a job, the job I had prior to being in private practice where I'm at right now, because I was noticing that I was getting a lot of men on my caseload. And for a long time, I was like, this is like beaming down to another planet. Like what? Like, I know I am a man, but like, there are definitely one of the most transformative moments I had with a client where he was asking me about, like, in like therapy land, we call it affect tolerance. So how to like get through something that feels stressful. And I was like going in this like very long, complicated, like DBT, like long thing. And he looked at me and he was like, oh, so you're just telling me to like nut up. I was like, yeah, I mean, I guess I am telling you that. I guess I am like, that's the clinical intervention. Nut up, I guess. Is that what I'm supposed to say? But going back to my colleague, he said to me, he's like, Nathaniel, your gay men and queer identified men for some straight men are actually really safe objects, because what happens is that you're not a woman, so you don't present as a woman, so you don't we don't have to perform in front of you. We don't have to do this weird mating ritual that straights do. That so we don't have to do that. We don't have to perform in this way, but you also have this emotional vocabulary that's you had to learn as a result of being wounded by homophobia, that you've learned how to develop, and you've learned how to be in this way. And you're also not a straight man, so you don't have to perform bro culture in this way. And so you occupy this very specific space that actually feels quite useful, because it's not it sort of like exists outside of all these normative spheres. And when he first framed that to me, I was like, oh, that's like a nice reframe to think about what's going on, and like an enduring gift of not to call homophobia a gift, but like the wound of not being a straight man, that what that's given me is a set of vocabulary that can be useful in terms of developing intimacy in the therapeutic setting with other men.
Well, I want to add something to that. I love what you're talking about because it's that sort of transformation of trauma. It's taking the traumatic event or the traumatic series of events that happen through life that homophobia creates, and transforming it into the power, into the strength, into the superpower kind of thing. And I have very similar experiences of that. My really good friend, who's also been a guest on this podcast, he and I talk regularly. Him as a heterosexual male, and myself as a gay man. The healing that's gone both directions in our friendship. And because as a gay man, I've been given permission in some ways because I've already failed as a man in our culture. I've been given permission to access more of that feminine side, the emotional literacy, the vulnerability, the care, the kindness. And he gets to experience some of that and start to play with his own feminine side, as a result of that. And in the other side of it, in a healthy heterosexual man, I get to repattern some of my own masculine wound, the places where I felt rejected by men, the places where I felt it wasn't safe to fully bring all of myself to the table. I think that's a really powerful space that you're talking about, that we as men and masculine identifying people can really inhabit. We can bring forward the transformation of trauma, as you said, just by being in the space with people.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yes, absolutely. There are also times that I feel really troubled by that. That there are times where it's like I don't, I have my own woundedness, and I have like I don't want to be that sort of like weird emotional surrogate, which is, I think, some of what. So when I have thought about my male friends, like I get kind of frustrated because then I become the like singular person that they're like, I had a feeling and it was bad. I was like, man, like, there, I'm banging on the table, sorry, you might have to edit that out. Like you might, I want you to take ownership of this process, and I want you to, and these are conversations that with my friend at whose home I did my laundry. He and I did have, I'm tired of coming over and being your like emotional interlocutor. I'm tired of trying to demystify your internality. At some point, I really want you to take this process onto yourself.
And I think that's super valid and a super important thing to keep an eye on as somebody who might have the tendency to fill that space, that emotional surrogate space. I mean, for somebody that doesn't want to be that, you've chosen some professions that kind of lead you in that direction.
Sure.
But as a person that tends towards that, isn't that also the responsibility of you as an individual, as a man, to borrow from masculinity, the boundaries of masculinity, and the not taking that on and sort of owning your own boundary in that. And that's sort of what you're communicating when you
Yeah.
say, I don't want you to have to do this. But just because somebody hands you something doesn't mean you have to take it from them.
That is, I'm going to have to write that on my mirror in lipstick to hold on to, because that's true.
Well, that's where we get to borrow from the healthy part of the masculine that does create boundaries, that does create safety, that does create the container for which the feminine energy can be safe within.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good reminder, and I think that's a lesson that I think is continuing to unfold for me, because, so to your point, like I've chosen a lot of, being a psychotherapist, and even in some ways being a yoga teacher. There are, these are professions where I'm like creating lots of space for people, and sometimes very literally creating space in their body to feel something new. And I'm the one who's sort of holding that and sort of doing that work and being that container. So yeah, I'll have to bust out my lipstick and put that on the mirror. It's good.
Well, I'm kind of interested in finding out a little bit more about the stories that created you and the stories that have sort of led you to these perspectives and led you into the fields that you had, by sort of slipping us back into the past and to really get some more clarity on, like, what are the stories that you were taught about masculinity, or what are the things you internalized as a young person in this world, whether they were positive or not?
What a great question. And I have a couple of thoughts. I've in thinking about this podcast, I and particularly identifying myself as a son, I've thought a lot about my father, with whom he and I are very similar in lots of ways, and he and I are also very, very different, and our similarities at times have felt like two ends of a magnet that actually repel us apart, than actually bring us closer together in some ways. And I think what my father taught me, and I can think of a specific moment. Ooh, this is embarrassing. I'll just tell the story. I got nothing. I hope all of my clients are listening to this so that you can know what a flawed human being your therapist is. I did something I wasn't supposed to do at a Taekwondo studio that I was at when I was younger, and someone caught me, and he was going to send me. In my mind, he was going to ban me from not the yoga studio, the Taekwondo studio, and I was like doing something that I shouldn't have done. What I did, this is the embarrassing part, because now it sounds like I've done something really bad. I peed in a shower. Okay, I was 8. Everybody, I was 8.
How dare you?
I know it was but I was so embarrassed. Somebody had caught me. He yelled at me. He shamed me in this way, and my mother was the one who was like doing all the emotional labor by driving her children around to all these extra activities. Thanks, Mom. And she, so I went back upstairs. She was waiting where parents waited, and I was like, I have to go home. I have to go home. And she's like, why? And I was like, I can't tell you that. I have to go home. And so we went home. She was like, oh, okay. So we went to go pick up my sister at ice skating, and then we went home. And I was sitting in my room. I wasn't sent to my room, but I was sitting in my room, and my father came in and he sat next to me, and he didn't ask me what I did. He didn't ask me what happened, but he was like, I remember him saying to me, Nathaniel, sometimes if you do something bad, you need to stand in that and you need to deal with the consequences of it. And so we went back to the Taekwondo studio, and I had to deal with the consequences of it, which he just told me I shouldn't pee in the shower again. It wasn't that bad, but it was just, I had all this shame. But my father, like, one of the things that he taught me was like, to be a man is to stand up and be counted. There's another story, that I'm remembering when I was very young, when I was in first grade. And my mother loves to tell this story. And I was a very polite child. I really, you know what? All I ever wanted to do when I was a kid was read books and play Barbies. That's all I ever wanted to do. And and like get along. That's all I ever wanted to do. So the first grade teacher, we were living in Mississippi at the time. My father's in the Navy, was in the Navy. And we were living in Mississippi, and the first grade teacher called my mother and used all this coded language about how so she said I was too polite, which is code for we think your son is a sissy. But I was too polite was what the teacher said. That was 1 week. And then about 2 weeks later, and I do remember, I remember the incident, that I was friends with girls. We were playing I was probably playing with my sister. She was there at the same time. We were probably at recess playing with my sister. And, and a girlfriend of mine, a friend of mine, in my mother's telling of the story, it's like it has reached like mythic proportions. She says the story that this girl across the playground is like, "Help me, Nathaniel, help me!" And apparently, I go running across the playground. I run up to this kid who was pulling her skirt up, was pulling her dress up. I remember that happening, and I remember pushing the kid and pushing him on the ground and standing between the two of them and being like, "You don't get to do that. That's wrong." And I do remember saying that. I do remember being this little kid. My fists were bunched, and I was like ready to take a swing at this kid. And the teachers had separated us and all these things. So 2 weeks after, this woman called me a queer, punching kids on the playground, pushing kids down on the playground.
Not so polite anymore.
Not so much. Yeah. I don't remember what your name is, first grade teacher, but I hope you ate those words. And so then she called my mother again. Mother was like, I was just here. What happened? And then I was so scared. I was so scared that I had done something wrong because I'd gotten in a fight. And so my mother, and I wouldn't tell my mother what happened, even though she knew because the teacher told her what happened. And my mother, in my mother's telling of it, asked me what I did. And I said, I'm not telling you what I did, which sounds on brand for me. And my father came home, and again, apparently all these moments happened with me in my bedroom and my father sitting down next to me. And he said to me, he's like, "You know what, Nathaniel? Sometimes you got to fight." And I do remember those words, sometimes you got to fight. Not all the time. My father never told me, be a man. I never heard those things. His sexism came across. He didn't treat my sister very well when we were adolescents. He wanted me to do house fixing up things, which is like, oh no, girl, that ain't gonna happen. I'm gonna go back to reading my books and playing with Barbies at 16. So, I'm not interested. But, so I'm not saying my father was free from that. He was totally deeply invested in some sexist stuff. But those are the two things that I remember sort of early and sort of very formative stories, was standing up and being counted. And sometimes you got to fight.
Well, I love that one of the earliest memories that you have of masculinity is about taking up space, because I think that is part of masculinity. I think that sort of owning the space that you're in, not being apologetic, not holding space for others, but just owning your own space. But I love that the next message underneath that is, but you have to take responsibility for your impact on others. You peeing in the showers has an impact on others in that scenario. And so not only do you take up space, but you also become aware of the impact you're having on others. And that's something that I personally want men to do more of. I'm not sure I see a lot of that. I see a lot of the taking space, which is a healthy thing to do, not being apologetic for taking up space, but also to understand and be aware of the impact that has on others.
Yeah.
And I love that that's something you were taught growing up.
Yeah. And I hadn't thought about it in that way, but that's a good way to frame it. I love that. Thanks, Dad. Good job.
He, in some ways, was teaching you empathy by asking you to take responsibility for your actions.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think my sister also taught me that, because we were there together all the time. And so there wasn't there were some things that were mine. There were some things that were hers, but we like anything that we had also had an impact on the other. I mean, this is just also having siblings, but it had an impact on each other. And we were the same age and all. So my sister also taught me those things as well. Another example of a woman doing my emotional labor for me, but I think in a necessary way.
Yeah, I think that is the difference between growing up with a female sister versus a male sister. Because in many ways, me having a brother, or I'm sorry, a male sibling, me having a brother, we were both trying to take up space with each other and wrestling and being unapologetic for our impact on each other. And so I think that it was our oftentimes our mom that was teaching us about that empathetic piece of like understanding our impact on others and trying to really teach that. And I think it's true that women have been responsible throughout time of trying to teach men a sense of empathy and understanding of their impact on others. And yet, I really want to encourage us as men to start doing that, asking each other to do that more often, to celebrating men who do that. Because I do think that that's a part of the privilege of being male is that we have a sense of power and the ability to influence each other. And why not use that?
Yeah, totally. Totally. Yes, men, listen to
Yes,
this.
men.
This is good. This is good. Yeah, no, I like that.
Did you find any lessons in childhood to be more on the challenging end of the spectrum, or ways that you internalized what being a man is that didn't serve you so much?
To my parents' credit, I can't in this moment recall things that didn't serve me about around in an explicit way around masculinity. I don't remember hearing things like man up. I don't remember things like you can't cry. I actually remember hearing the opposite from my mother. Um, and when I was also when we were living in Mississippi, and this is a chronic health issue that I have like every twice a year I get a really bad sinus infection. And if it's not treated, it becomes pneumonia. And when I was much younger, we didn't know what it was. It was like all these different kinds of things. And so I was taken to a specialist. They wanted to open me up and do exploratory surgery. They thought I had cystic fibrosis. I didn't. They didn't need surgery. I needed to be taken to a pulmonologist. And so eventually that happened. But I was scared. I was scared that I was going to have surgery. And I remember my mother she was like, it's okay to be scared. Because I was terrified. I was terrified to answer the phone because for some reason I got it in my mind that I was going to get a phone call. The phone was this ghost that was haunting me. But, I remember my mother telling me it's going to be okay it is okay to be afraid.
I love that you were afraid of a phone call and for whatever reason, some very non-tangible reason. I was just afraid to answer the phone because I was worried I was going to get a "Hello, Mrs. Stock," my little boy voice.
Yeah. No, I was afraid I was going to be told I was going to die. Like that's how I had interpreted. I'm kind of a drama queen. That is not a new feature in my life. But I remember my mother telling me that it was scary. It was okay to be afraid. And my father, even though he was in the military and there were lots of men around him that I remember being like very invested in like toughening up. My father never said anything. My father never demanded I play sport. I played Little League baseball for a season and I was real bad. But my father was the assistant coach. He never said anything bad about me or to me. He actually tried to help teach me things, and I'm a bad student sometimes. And he didn't shame me in that way that I hear often. What I think showed up more was how I saw, and to some extent my mother, treat my sister in like invisible ways, and in ways that were never entirely clear to me, and in some ways that are still being unfolded for me. She shared things with me that are her stories that sound incredibly wounding, that I had no idea what were going on, but the fact that they were happening to her, but I was protected from them because I was the male child. I think it shows up in that way. I think I got to enjoy a lot of protection from that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the classic conversation around male privilege, and things unknown are the unknown parts that create privilege, the parts that we didn't know because we didn't experience the other side of something.
Yeah.
And to have opportunities in life to become aware of that are really important, of where you couldn't see, not because it wasn't expected that you could see that or you could predict that that was happening, but to have the experience of being able to see someone else's experience and be able to recognize how different yours was from that and how that set you up differently.
Yeah. And it did set us up differently. Yeah. I could talk about my sister for hours. She's such a great human.
I love it.
Yeah, she's back east. I miss her. So yeah.
Shout out to sister. What's her name?
Yeah. Her name is Vanessa.
Shout out to Vanessa.
Yeah. Shout out to Vanessa. Yes.
I hope she listens.
She better. She loves me, right, Vanessa? But
so let's add another layer to this then, which is to find out your relationship to masculinity by adding the next identity on, which is sort of being a man that loves men, being queer in this world.
Yeah. I'm smiling. There are lots of things I love, in a non-romantic or non-sexual way about men and masculinity. And then there are so many things that I love about men and I love about masculinity that, in my prep work for this, I had written, this is actually borrowed from a woman friend of mine, that, there's something intoxicating about toxic masculinity. And there have definitely been moments in my life where I have felt that, where I have felt like totally intoxicated by men who take up a lot of space unapologetically, who are kind of rude but aggressive, who have this swagger about them. And like I remember when I was younger, I remember all of the pop culture. Should have been my first clue. All of the like pop culture characters that I identified with were all women, and the men that they were dating were like very like men. They were masculine. They were aggressive. In Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which was deeply informative for my psychosocial but also psychosexual development. My favorite character was Jadzia Dax, and there's like so many. She's so queer. She's so like there's so many different things that are going on with her, and she eventually married Worf, which, if you're not familiar with Star Trek, dear listeners, please check that out, because Worf is he's this Klingon, but he's this warrior, but he's also a poet, and there are just so many things that I was just like, I am about this. I don't know what this is, and I am like 10, but I am here. I am here for Worf and the sexy feelings that I'm having for him. It's this like, and I'm not, and it is problematic. Like this is not like a poem in service of singing the graces of toxic masculinity. No, it's not that, but there is something that is so erotic, and I don't mean that in like a pornographic way, but like so like connecting and charged about that for me, and to be sexually and romantically attracted to men in that way is at times really exhilarating, and even like I'm thinking about the physicality of it, like men who exercise and who have I'm laughing at myself, but like men who are like built, who work out, who are very clear, like have like fill out a nice t-shirt, is like, oh, I love the way you're like, mm-hmm. It's like,
Hmm. Oh,
mm-hmm.
we can all. Well, you're not
Yep,
alone here.
yeah,
Go
yep,
ahead.
yep, yep. And like there is something, and I know, I know that a lot of rigorous exercise sometimes comes from a really wounded place. Um, and so it's I have this relationship with masculinity, and sometimes like the darker sides of it that I know it. I'm like I've been like way too overeducated to not spot it, to not see it. But there's also something that I'm at 34, un like only now beginning to unravel and sort of be curious about in the gay community and sort of the queer male community and on the apps on Grindr and on Scruff and all the other ones. There's this idea about mask for mask, um, which is a phenomenon. Um,
Meaning masculine for masculine. Like I'm a
Correct.
masculine person and I'm searching for a masculine person.
Yep.
Just want to
And
slow that down for all those who are not on the apps with us.
yeah, exactly. Which, occasionally I'm like, oh, these apps are awesome. And occasionally I'm like, oh my God, this is a dumpster fire. Please save me. But here we are. This is what's going on.
Welcome to 2020.
Welcome to 2020. We're on the apps. We're on the apps, everybody. And there's been a lot of dialogue, both within the community and also outside the community, sort of with other people around how problematic that phenomenon is. And it is. It's like rooted in sexism. It's deeply fucked up. It's like, it's real bad, real messy. Like I want to live in a world where we are not intoxicated by toxic masculinity. That's the aspiration I want to be in and I want to strive for. Absolutely. And also it persists and it's become sneakier because it'll show up in ways that are like, oh, I'm really athletic or I really like sports. And so now there's like this complicated system of codes that we have to sift our way through to arrive at essentially the same place, which is an unproblematized, deeply oppressive and wounding part of trying to negotiate this particular phenomenon. Um, and what's been interesting, so sort of being on the apps, my hair is much shorter now. When I moved to Seattle, I like was in this moment where I wanted to grow my hair out. I had this vision of this beautiful like bun that I was going to have, and all my hair was super long. But like my hair has gotten shorter, more of these mask for mask dudes are messaging me on the apps. And I'm like, wow, it is like it feels like I'm like fucking Jane Goodall with these guys. And I'm like, tell me all your weird shit. Like, what is this about? It's so like from like going from long hair where people literally would say, I like everything about you, like everything is great except that long hair, all the way up until it's like totally flipped in this weird way.
Well, I think that's such an interesting thing you're talking about that I don't know that many people outside of the gay community, the LGBT community, those that are not on the apps, sort of have a reference point for, which is the complicated relationship we all, as men or masculine identifying people, those of us that also love men and that are sexually attracted to men, that we navigate is that it's a complex relationship. It has trauma involved in it. It has fear involved in it. It has rejection involved in it. And something that I keep coming to as a member of this community, as I've done my own personal work, as I work with other gay men, is that I keep finding that we are a community of men who are in some ways wounded little boys.
Yeah.
We were limited in the exploration of ourselves in our youth and our adolescence. We were rejected. We were hurt. We were powerless. We felt very powerless. And so one of the things that keeps coming up for me is that sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally, we're a bunch of boys that get together and try to date and try to find each other. And yet we end up re-wounding each other because we're also a community that hasn't done a lot of our work around that trauma, that hasn't done a lot of the exploration of that and the transformation of that. And so it's deeply complex. And I think that sort of early rejection of childhood often then becomes eroticized later on. It's like a replaying of the trauma. It's the continuation of something that where we ended up having to fracture away from ourselves, and we keep playing that out. And that can be done very intentionally and very like fun and playfully, but it also can be done in very shadowy ways that keeps us stuck in these looping patterns with each other. And I think, as you were saying, we find different words to kind of arrive at the same thing and to sort of continue the cycle of rejection, or the cycle of who has power and who doesn't. I have abs, and so I can use that as currency on an like anybody. That's what we use in our community, is our abs are our currency. And so it's a false sense of power that then allows you to feel like you can reject others. And I think that that's an important thing to keep looking at, is that complex relationship between what masculinity or traditional masculinity might have felt to us as we were growing up, and how do we relate to it now, and how do we continue to evolve our relationship to something that serves us. Not saying that being attracted to somebody who's very fit and muscular and very masculine presenting, not saying that that's a bad thing, but being conscious of where that choice comes from, and conscious of where that those inner urges come from.
Yeah. And I think, to build on that, or maybe just to say the same thing, I'm not sure. I'm single, all the people who are out there.
He's on the apps, and he's on a new app. He's on the Apple Podcast app.
Right, exactly.
Searching for dates.
Ooh, okay, all right. Okay, that's going to happen. Great, awesome. Okay. And that part of the problem, the challenge that I have had pretty consistently, is that I like that wound that you're talking about. There are the way that I've conceptualized it is that we were wounded, and that's the homophobia. And we're just talking about or at least in my mind, this model applies to like white, cis, affluent, able-bodied guys. So like we start adding even more systems of privilege and oppression into this analysis, and it becomes even more challenging. So, unfortunately, I'm narrowing my analysis to these two features of my identity. But we've got the wounding that comes from homophobia, and then a shutting down of access to a vocabulary to talk about that woundedness. And it's like one of the questions that I've been really struggling with in my dating life is how to establish intimacy with other men when that project feels doomed from the start. That it's like, I don't know how, and perhaps because of my own limitations in my own masculinity, it becomes like the space in dating and in finding a romantic partner who's going to hang around for more than a few months, that project of intimacy feels so fraught and so challenged in that way, because of the woundedness, and then because of the lack of the ability to talk about it.
Do you think that part of that, though, is taking on responsibility for both sides of the relationship, for both individuals' parts? Like, in some ways, is it really your job to foster that intimacy between you and a partner, or is it the job of the couple to be able to do that? I think that I spent much of my dating world trying to be the one to foster it for the relationship, and make men the men I was with have a different vocabulary and a different ability. And it wasn't until the current relationship that I'm in right now where I saw, I don't have to do all the work.
Yeah.
That already exists. And it's about finding that kind of person. And then that's sort of what I'm doing with this podcast, not in a dating sense, but gathering men that I see that already get that intimacy piece, that already get that vulnerability and that emotional language kind of piece. Because I think strength in numbers starts to be the thing that helps to accomplish that goal that you're talking about of transforming masculinity and the way that we view emotions and vulnerability and intimacy.
Yeah. I love this like mini coaching I'm getting here. Thank you. It's
Sometimes
great.
I can't help but I can't take the hat off all the time.
It's good. It's good. No, I love it. I love it. It's no, that's good to think about. Sure. And I think there is something that, so it's sort of like two things, right? There's a piece around like trying to find a partner where that is already built in, but then I'm like, where are those people? Because my experience has been more that hasn't been the case. And maybe I'm just, and again, like this, so back to the very beginning of the podcast, like I think there are times where I can be very down on men. And I do have to remember that does exist and that is possible. And that's part of the project that you're engaging in here. I think there are other folks who are doing it.
Sounds like you also do it in your work with male clients too. In those partnerships, in those couple sessions that you're doing, you're trying to help build that in men in their relationships.
Yeah. Oh yeah. 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 Absolutely. Can't date my clients though, so that's
yeah. No, I get that. But I just wanted to point out that you are doing it in some realms of your life, and it doesn't feel like such a task or a fail, something doomed from the start.
Totally. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And it is, I think what this is making me think about is like a horizon for masculinity. In anticipation of joining you on the podcast, I talked to my best friend about this when I was down in California, and I had said that one of the things that I find really tough about talking about masculinity is that we can all really, this is sort of getting off topic around the queer part, but we can all identify the ways in which it's bad, the ways in which it's like not serving us. And what I love about this project and what I love about what you're doing is that you're trying to figure out actually what is sustainable and what actually is good about masculinity. And I think that that's such a worthwhile project because if we're just going to sit around and say like, oh, this is all bad, but then we don't have anything else, then
what's the point?
What's the point? We're all sitting around being like, this is bad, but then it never changes. It never shifts in this way.
So do you have any clear indications or sort of like, what are some of the pillars of masculinity that you do see as positive, or the ones that you do want to see more of in the world?
I would like to see, I think what is good, and you said this, so I'm just going to borrow your language if that's okay. That the having boundary is one thing, taking up space is another. Those qualities, and those are just two. I'm sure, I hope more will occur to me aside from the ability to fill out a nice T-shirt. Like those qualities are really good qualities to have. They do, to use your language, they create the container. And what I would want to add to that in this vision of a new masculinity is the impact of those things. And being able to be less rigid around the container has to look like this, and it can only look like this. And so then trying to get out of that like hyper boundary making, hyper containing or hyper container making, which is choking life out of things and choking, like in some ways, like literally choking life out of men. I mean, we die sooner. We're like all of these things is like literally killing us. But those are important qualities. It's important to, sometimes you got to fight. Sometimes you got to stand up and you got to take up space.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm doing with this podcast. I will be very honest and vulnerable that taking up space in this way and bringing myself to the table and sharing my perspectives in these ways has felt like a very vulnerable thing and a very scary thing to do in the world. And as a part of my own healing, I've come to this podcast saying, I am going to take a seat at the table. I am going to have this conversation, even though my childhood and what I internalized in my child brain was is that I failed as a man. No, here's the transformation part for me, is where I step forward and say, I think I might have some clarity on where this is going and what's needed moving forward. So I love that you're talking about that, and I do think it is an important part of the masculine. And I also love that there's that challenge that you're pointing out, which is like the masculine has really good strength at creating the container and the structure from within which things happen, but then to be able to bring in the femininity piece, which the feminine energy piece, not female, but the feminine energy, which is more flexible and that is more that the walls can expand. Like think about like even just like very archetypal, the sort of birth process, the expansion of the womb to create. And so to be able to be sort of leaning into the strength of creating structure and the container, but also to be flexible within that, how that container looks and where it goes and where the walls are at different times, I think
Yeah.
I think it's a challenge that I'm hope that more men will continue to explore.
Yeah. Yeah. Same. Definitely. Yes. 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 Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
So, are there qualities within yourself that you continue to find challenging to bring forward because they don't fit traditional masculinity or what masculinity brings up? Sort of came up earlier as we were talking. You were saying, you were talking about your friend, and even the saying that I love you part felt vulnerable. For me,
Mm,
in reading the intro that I wrote about you and sharing that intimacy felt super vulnerable and scary
yeah.
to bring forward. And I was like, oh. And so, are there other parts of yourself that you find challenged to bring forward still?
Yes. And what I'm thinking about particularly is again at the intersection point of queerness, gayness, however we're talking about it, and masculinity and the capacity for intimacy. There's a fear that I have that if I tell one of my male friends that I love him, that it will be misinterpreted or misheard in some way, that I like feel predatory. Like this is how I've internalized homophobia, that I'm like a dirty gay man, that I'm like preying on other men in some kind of way. And so there's definitely that piece that's there. And to be honest, there are definitely moments where I have a hard time differentiating in my own that I have a hard time differentiating are the relation or are the feelings of closeness, of a desire to be close. Am I misinterpreting it? Am I wrong in some way? Will I be misinterpreted? Will I be the target of violence if I say, I love you as an expression of like, I feel close to you? That I really do struggle with that in my relationships with men. And I think so thinking about my friendships with other gay or queer identified men, that's been something that I've struggled with for a long time. That I will sometimes make the joke that there's the gay handshake, that we have to have sex with each other before we actually are like interested to get to know each other as friends, because the community is so hypersexualized. Like that's how we say hello to each other. And that sort of contributes to the confusion in my mind, because there are some times that I feel defensive or protective of myself, that I'm like, I don't want to be this object of your like sexual attraction or your sexual expression. And there have been times that I've misread that, and that I worry that I misread that, or I worry that I misread it with myself, and I worry that it will be misread by other men.
Well, it's a couple of things that I pull out that I hear in that are
Mm-hmm.
a desire to keep self safe, which I think is completely valid. Sort of the threat of physical violence is something we do face as queer men in this
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
And I think that's super valid. And that is an important part of the way that each one of us has learned over time to keep ourselves safe, is to limit our expression in at different times. But then there's also this place of it's like there's this almost a distrust in male relationships, whether they are gay to straight, straight to gay, gay to gay. It doesn't matter. Any like male identifying people coming together, that there's this threat that somehow our own sexuality and our sexual urges and our desire places are leaking out on each other, and that
Yeah.
we're not self-containing them, and that we're not able, and there's a distrust piece that's in there
Yeah.
that comes. And I think that that's also what women are experiencing in our life, in the world with men, is that
Yeah.
sort of leaky sexual energy, that
Hmm.
asking women to dress in certain ways so that they're not so sexually provocative to men, to victim blaming when sexual assault happens. I think that's happening, and I think that you're actually pointing to a masculine issue where our sexuality and our sexual desire and our urges and our sexual energy is not self-contained. It's it's asking others to do the emotional labor of working through that energy that's placed on them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's thank you. I think that that's actually a really brilliant reflection and frame around what I just said.
It
No,
feels
that's
like
great.
that's a I think that it feels like a broader thing that you're addressing and that
Hmm.
you're looking at within yourself, is that understand, like, this is another place where we take up space, not be ashamed of our sexuality and not be ashamed of our sexual urges and desires, but also that place where we also take responsibility for it's how we impact others with it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's an important thing for men to start looking at, is not to make our sexuality wrong, or our sexual desires, or desire to be physical with somebody at all wrong, and to put any shame on top of that. But it
Hmm.
is to start really looking at that piece of, how am I impacting others with it?
Yeah.
Am I inadvertently leaking that energy out and making people feel a certain way, or making them have to do the emotional labor work of navigating that terrain with me? Or am I not trusting myself
Yeah.
with my energy? Like, even if you are sexually attracted to a straight male, does it necessarily mean that you're going to then do something about it? Why are we so afraid of all that energy? And I think that that is an important thing for all men to look at.
Yeah. No, that's great. I appreciate the sort of generous interpretation there, that and the way that it's touching sort of a broader issue. When I was listening to the prior episodes of the podcast, I found myself really curious for the other men who are on there. I'm like, what would your female friends say about you? Because they were all so lovely, and it was lovely to hear them talk about sort of their own ideas and their own ways of being. And I found myself really curious, like does that match? Does that match the experience of other people around you? Hopefully it does. I'm not saying it necessarily does or doesn't, but I found myself really curious, as I often sort of a neurotic way find myself curious. Like I would love to sit here and tell everyone I am a good man. I do good man things. I'm a feminist. I like have an intersectional approach to everything, and like I love, whatever. I would love to be a good man, but there are times I'm not always convinced I am. And not because I am a bad person or a bad agent, but because there are invisible things that are at play that I'm benefiting from, that I have very little incentive to be curious about, and because that's how privilege works, right? And and sometimes very little sense of my own impact and other people. Um, so that's why, I mean, it's just, we're sort of going full circle. It's so sweet to hear you say all those nice things about me, because I'm like, oh, that's such a nice reflection. Thank you. I hope that's certainly how I want to be perceived in the world. I hope that is how I'm perceived in the world.
And you're also human, and you, as
Yeah.
you're pointing out, you also have the space to be flawed, and you have the space. I mean, I love the question you asked about, would the women in these men's lives answer the same way, or reflect the same qualities about them. that's a very risky question to ask
It
for
is.
any of us men to ask the
Yeah.
women in our lives, is
Yeah.
to ask what our impact is. And it's an interesting exercise. I think do it in safe relationships that you can trust and that are generous in their interpretation of you. But I do think it's a powerful exercise to look at. And I also think that many of the men would be reflected in that same way by the women in their lives because
Totally.
I've been in their lives and I've curated a lot of these men myself to bring them to the table. But even the fact that you're assessing that in your head of those places where you fail, those places where you are not incentivized to be curious because of your privilege, even the fact that you're having that thought process and contemplating that and being curious about that in your mind points out a really important skill that I want more men to be able to develop, which is don't expect perfection in yourself. Don't shame yourself for the places where you are flawed or where you have been brought up to believe or to act or to think a certain way. But do be conscious.
Yeah.
Do be curious about your inner workings and about the way that you engage with the outside world, because it's important to do so, and the way you engage with the inside world too.
Yeah, totally. Same.
Yeah. So my favorite question to sort of wrap up the conversation that we're having, that I'm asking all men, is if there's one offering or one piece of advice that you could give to men from your perspective, something you've gained either through your work with other male clients, something you've gained through your own journey with masculinity, what's one piece of advice or offering that you could distill down for men?
It's a lot of pressure.
You're welcome.
It's a lot of pressure because I hope I'm going to answer the question, but I'm going to try to not answer it initially. It's a lot of pressure because there's something I want to say about love more, like choose love, but that feels like simultaneously like specific enough to say something, but also vague enough to mean nothing.
So tell me what you mean by that.
So sort of where like I think love I listened to a TED talk by a philosopher who I actually don't like very much, but he had articulated this definition of love, which I share with a lot of my clients, and so I guess I do like him in some way. But it that love is a persistent act of a generous interpretation. And so that, like, do that of yourself, do that with others, do that with other men, do that with the women in your life. So like choose love, and choose love in all the ways that it happens. Um, there's another, so like I think a lot about the erotic, not in like sexy times way, but in a way that it's connecting and it's generative. I also want, that's like part of why I practice yoga, and part of what I teach when I teach yoga is like yoga is an act of intimacy. It's an act of constantly connecting to seemingly different things, your body, your breath, your mind, your body, like all these different kinds of things. It's a practice of connection and of intimacy. That feels like an act. It feels like a deeply erotic act because it's about connecting. And that also feels like a feature of choosing love. And choose, it's like choose love and don't take any shit. It's like don't like catch the people who are like really fake about love, catch people who are sexual predators, like, just if I will say, because I say this quite often, like if Nancy Reagan gave us anything, it's this lovely slogan of just say no. So just say no, just Nancy Reagan that shit, and like choose love and take no shit.
I love it. I think it's super insightful, and I think that I would totally agree. It's like be willing to take up that space and not take shit from people, but also I that phrase is really sticking with me. That sort of generous interpretation of those around you. That I think in some traditional masculine sort of systems, not just males, but masculine systems like patriarchies and capitalism, you get a lot of power dynamics and a lot of scarcity, and you get a lot of there's not enough. but sort of that generous interpretation of those around you is the antidote to that. It's that choosing that generous love, that generosity towards others, giving of yourself generously, but also having enough boundaries to keep yourself contained.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not taking shit from others. I love it.
That is right. We do
I
not. We need to 2020, y'all, take no shit.
Yeah,
So.
Nathaniel and I also have our hashtag for the year, which is hashtag no more trash.
Yeah, exactly.
So if people wanted to connect with you further or are interested in seeing more of the work you're doing in the world, how might they do so?
Well, I think the easiest way to get in touch with me is over email, which is it's my first name, so Nathaniel, Nathaniel .Amos, my last name, AM as in mother, OS as in Sam, at gmail.com. I'm also totally Googleable. My like very nice. I have a nice scarf on. Yeah, it's very nice on Psychology Today. And I'm also on Instagram, and I only have one Instagram, and it's open to the public. And it's Mr. N as in Nathaniel Hawthorne 1085, which is like, I feel like an old handle I've held on to throughout the years. I like staked a claim at that one, and I was like, I'm gonna have this one.
So is my Instagram. It's my first AOL email address.
Yeah, see, exactly. So email's probably the best, but I am a millennial and I love Instagram likes. So if you want to follow me on Instagram, it's Mr. N Hawthorne or Mr. N Hawthorne 1085 on Instagram.
It gets witchy, it gets queer, it gets very Scorpio energy. I'm here for it.
Yes.
I'll put all that information in the show notes so that people can find you. If people want to get in touch with me, they can go to my website at travisstock.com. You can also email me at travisstock03@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at travers03. But those are all ways that you can get in connection with me. I love supporting other men in this journey. I love mentoring other men around this and having these kinds of conversations. If that's something you're interested in doing, please reach out. If you're wanting to participate in this conversation on the podcast, also please reach out. Love where this is going. Love all the feedback I'm getting. I'm so grateful that you joined me on this episode, Nathaniel. You have added such a unique texture to it and added something that I'm really glad people are going to be able to hear. You add such a realness, but also a professional quality and some professional wisdom, but then also this very queer identity that's really important in the conversation around masculinity. I think we as queer people have a lot to offer for where masculinity is going.